Okay. So there's been an update on the Dark and Darker Nexon DMCA thing. They released a big ass fucking this. Let's just open this real quick. I'm not gonna read from here because there's a lot, and it's just easier to read it on the Reddit. You know. And I'm not gonna read the whole thing word for word because I've already read it, and I'm too dyslexic to read it word for word. So we're not doing that. Essentially, what this whole starting is about is the origin of the idea that was under Nexon supposed to be the P3 project, which was, I don't know, supposedly similar to Dark and Darker. But the guy behind P3, who worked at Nexon, P3 was canceled, and then he moved on to make Dark and Darker. So Nexon has claimed that it's their game idea, which is ridiculous, as we'll get to in a minute. But that's just, that's what that is. It's talking about the origins of the idea for Dark and Darker. Then we move on. It talks about COVID and the server. I can't speak about the server asset thing. That's clearly out of anybody's knowledge that's not involved. So I'm not even going to talk about that. Okay, then we get to the game concept, genre, and plot. If you've ever played Dark and Darker, you would know that there's not a plot. Yet, at least. The concept is something that we'll get to further down. But just speaking on it right now, the concept of dungeon delvers going into a dungeon to get treasure. Does that sound like a specific idea? I mean, there's so many games, and even D&D itself is about dungeon delvers going into a dungeon. And yeah, you could say PvP, maybe. I think specifically the two big mechanics that were brought up were torches and doors, which likewise is fucking crazy. I mean, for doors, have you played Hunt Showdown? Or any game that involves doors for cover against PvP action? I mean, that's so many games, that's ridiculous to bring up. Torches, that's a typical dungeon crawler thing. I mean, that's, you know, that argument is nonsense to me. They say that a lot of their assets were bought from the Unreal Marketplace, which makes sense because they're not beautiful or anything, with some changes. I think the argument from Nexon is that they were designed to look like the ones from the P3 project. That's whatever. I think the other thing was that a lot of the art looks like the same art from their P3 project. Which, if the guy from that art department from Nexon that was working on the P3 then goes to the Dark and Darker project, it would look the same anyways. I mean, you can change some design aspects of it, but if you're making, in the first scenario, if you're making art by the same artist for a dungeon crawler fantasy game, and then you say, hey, we're not doing that anymore, come with me and let's make art for a dungeon crawler fantasy game, I mean, is it really gonna look that much different? I mean, unless he starts drawing like anime shit, like, but that's not the style of the game, because it's supposed to be a classic Dungeons and Dragons fantasy style. I'll read this specifically to reinforce what I was saying earlier. And the notice then states the similarities in the character design and other settings and structural designs of the two games. Our response is that both games rely on very traditional classic fantasy tropes, none of which are original and can be found in numerous other fantasy games, including the listed characters, classes, and torch mechanics. Both games, being in the same genre of a classic fantasy dungeon crawler, can explain these similarities. Exactly. So, I'm skipping a lot of shit because it is just long-winded ways to make small points. This was the funny part. So, to prove that they're not just stealing the idea of P3, which, I mean, honestly, I wouldn't even care if they did because the guy made it. And then, Nexon, you're hired to whatever, fucked up. If I make a good idea and it get canceled by some shitty people, I'm gonna take the idea and make it somewhere else. So here we go. The premise of adventurers delving into dungeons full of monsters and treasure in their quest to seek riches is so generic and common that it can broadly be applied to numerous other fantasy games. Just for fun, we asked ChatGPT to come up with a description for a generic PvP dungeon crawling game that created an eerily similar game description below. And I'll read most of this. Hey ChatGPT, create the generic game. Certainly. Here's a generic game description for a PvP dungeon crawling game. In this PvP dungeon crawling game, players compete against each other in a dangerous and mysterious dungeon filled with traps, puzzles, and monsters. Players choose their characters from a variety of classes, each with unique abilities and playstyles. They must navigate through the dungeon, fight off waves of monsters, and solve puzzles to progress deeper into the dungeon. However, in addition to battling monsters, players must also face off against each other in intense PvP combat. They can attack other players and steal their loot or gain an advantage. But they must also be careful not to get caught off guard by enemy players. Along the way, players will collect loot, weapons, and magical items that will help them in their quest. They can also trade items with other players or buy and sell items from NPC shops. The gameplay involves strategic decision-making, as players must decide when to attack other players and when to focus on advancing through the dungeon. They must also manage their resources carefully, as they have a limited supply of weapons, spells, and health. The ultimate goal of the game is to reach the deepest level of the dungeon and defeat the final boss, all while outsmarting and defeating other players. This game offers an exciting and competitive experience for players who enjoy both PvE and PvP gameplay. So if you take out the PvP part, it sounds like every dungeon crawling game out there. I mean, you could apply this to, like, Skyrim. You know, well, of course, Skyrim has more than just the dungeon crawling, but I mean, even something like Entry and Odyssey, or, God, what was that game called? Whatever, a bunch of stuff. I mean, and you could even say, like, Kingsfield, because the game plays like Kingsfield to some degree. The slow first-person melee combat and move speed. It's just, oh, what was that game called? It was, Wizardry. Yeah, Wizardry, too. I think Wizardry is a big inspiration for the whole dungeon crawling experience, right? Of course, they play very different, but same style of dungeon crawling and whatnot. So, yeah. Blah, blah. Can't, in good faith, say any of this makes sense, is essentially what this is saying here. And I'd have to agree. To me, this is the part where I give my opinion, because that's what I do. I said in the last video that I don't care even if they did steal the assets, because they would make a far better game than Nexon, and I don't care if that's immoral. Fuck that. If it's gonna make a better product, then fuck it. But even on top of that, just addressing the accusations directly, I think the accusations, now knowing more in depth as to what they were, is ridiculous. The concept of a dungeon crawling game is super generic, and you could say that I don't know if P3 had the idea of PvP in it. I didn't see that when I read it. Maybe there's still some information I didn't see. Who knows? But a cooperative dungeon crawling game with PvP elements, it's kind of just taking dungeon crawlers and then the popular genre of game, like extraction-based games like Hunt Showdown and Tarkov. I mean, those are like, don't get me wrong, just because it's generic doesn't mean it's not great, because it's fucking fun as hell. But I mean, these aren't like crazy trade. They kept saying it in the document. They stole our trade secrets. Like, it's not that insane of something to come up with. Like Like they had a special recipe they were brewing, and then this guy just took it and fucking fled. It's like, it's a dungeon crawling game with extraction-based PvP gameplay type shit, right? It's not that. That just comes off to me like they're jealous. And I think I also read that they're trying to make P3 again, so that would make sense as to why they're trying to take it down, because Dark and Darker had huge positive reviews and ratings and saying this is fucking amazing, which is why I played it, because I heard it was fucking great, and it is. It's fun to play. So it makes sense that Nexon trying to take it down to take all those players. But I'll tell you right now, I would not play it from Nexon, because Nexon would ruin it. They would monetize everything. Buy fucking health potions in the dungeon with real life currency. Like, no way. Not happening. So, that's the update. I hope that it all gets resolved, because I really do like Dark and Darker. I would like to play that some more. So there you go. Alright. Bye-bye.